In this lesson, we're going to take a look at a feature that was removed from view a few versions ago, and it was a unscaled UV input node for controlling texture maps. I'm going to show you a way to to basically restore this feature so that you can use it once again, because it is very useful. Now, what this does, and I already have it set up here, is it allows you to change the scale of the material independently from the texture map. So if I change the scale to 5, now we see in the OpenGL it does change the size, but if we take a look at the render, the scale of the material remains the same. Now, this is useful for controlling fractal scales and having them be independently controlled from the texture map. And I'm just using a brick texture right now, and we can change the image scale. And I do need to set this to repeat, so that you can control the size of the texture map. But when you modify that material scale, it will not affect the scale of the texture. So it's completely independent. So what we can do is, let's just add a bump map. And we'll add in a fractal, and we'll do a simple fractal. Just connect that to the bump and the altitude output. Go ahead and increase the scale of the bump. And now we have world standard set for the scale. I'm going to go ahead and reduce that down to 1. And I'll actually bring the image scale back to 1. And we can start to see that bump map showing up. Now this is world based, so we can move the object through the texture if we want. And we can also change the scale without losing the scale of the texture map. So how I did this, and you may have noticed the layer painting node within the material. So what we're going to do is take the texture map that's built into the terrain material map for painted layers. And we can use this to modify and create an unscaled UV. So I'm going to go ahead and reset the material. And I'm going to just create a standard terrain, edit the material, edit the terrain. So edit object, and then it has added the default rock surface to it. If it hasn't added any material, you can just go ahead and add a new material layer. And then what we need to make sure we do is just paint a little bit on there. Otherwise it won't register the new material. And then we're going to go into the material for the terrain, edit the material, and what we can see is that default rock, and now we have alpha production that is generated by that layer painting. Now we're not going to use the layer painting node itself. What we're going to use is what is inside. So what we can do is edit that meta node, and we can grab the layer painting node and copy it. So Control C, we can copy it. Click OK. Go back into our cube material, and what we're going to do is just paste it, Control V. And then we are going to connect the color output to the layer painting node and click OK. Now it's going to publish the parameter for this texture map you can either leave that published or remove it. You do need to make sure you do not remove it before you connect it to the output, otherwise this won't work. So I do want to set the tiling to repeat so that we don't have that black outline. And then what we can do is clear the texture map with the little trash can and then add in, and I'm just going to use the brick wall that comes with view. And then I'm going to delete the terrain and go back to the cube. And now we have an unscaled UV setup. So we can modify the scale, and it will not change with the material scale. So now we have independent control where this is locked as a world parametric or object parametric and linked to the scale of the object. Which is what we would get in the object parametric mode. If you were to edit this and go into the mapping mode as object parametric, or mapping mode position, which you can see is grayed out in this node. But typically if you were to add a texture map, projected texture map, you would have a mapping position mode. And you could set that to object parametric. And if the material scale was set to 1, then it would remain the correct scale. But once you change that material scale beyond 1, either upper or lower, or higher or lower, it's going to modify the scale of the texture map. So this way, we've got the unscaled UV back, which is pretty nice, because now we can modify either object-based fractals or world-mapped fractals, and control the scale where we can make it a little bigger, a little smaller if we have bump or highlights or anything like that connected to it. But we want the texture map to stay the same. And in this case, what we could even do is, let's say we wanted to blend this, and what I'm going to do is create combiner blender, take the color output of the texture map, and let's add in a color map. I'm going to go to rock and grass and just load in black and white, and then add in a fractal. We'll go ahead and use terrain fractal version 2, connect that to the altitude, and then we can connect that to input 1 in the blender, and then we're going to multiply, which will darken up areas with the fractal, so we can kind of dirty it up. And I'm going to go ahead and change the scale. And now we can modify that multiplied color map. And then if we need to adjust the scale like I just did, 0.05, we don't need to worry about changing the texture. So that's pretty cool. Now if you don't want to have to go in and copy and paste this every time you want to use that node, what you can do is create a meta node with it that you should be able to load in. Or what you can do is clear out the surface and everything else within the function and save the material. So if you want, you could just load in that material with the setup, the texture map. But if you've already got a fractal you want to set up, you want to add it to it. Since you can't create a meta node with just one fractal, or just one node, What I'm going to do is add in a color node, color correction, and select color blending. And then what I'm going to do is choose the layer painting as the input, and then I can set the blending ratio to 0 and set the color output to the color blend. And this will allow us to still edit the texture the same way as we always would, because the color blend option is available within the color in alpha. So then what we can do is select both of these nodes and create a meta node. And then what we can do is save this. And in the main meta node folder, create a new folder and call it Texture Map, if you don't have one already. And then Unscaled UV. And save. And even through the meta node, it'll still work properly, which is pretty cool. But what you want to do typically when you want to load this in, and another thing you might want to do is clear out the texture when you save it. So I'm going to go ahead and clear the texture and save it as a version 2. Because I just want to make sure that it doesn't need to have a texture in order to work. Because you never know with Vue. Sometimes it would need a texture first when you load it in order for it to work properly. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and clear the material out, reset it, edit the material, and go to edit function, and we can delete the nodes that are in there and go under texture map, meta nodes, and select that unscaled 2 and select the color output, and then load in a material, and I'll just select that brick wall again. And let's see if that works properly. And it is. So now you can have it blank, and that way it's not using texture map within the file in case the texture map is no longer on the system, or you want to move it to another system where it might not have a link to it, and that way you just avoid an error. Now if you want to get access to those, the rest of the commands, you could either edit the meta node, but the easiest way is just to ungroup the meta node, and that way you have access to all the controls. So it's a pretty useful little setup, and it's unfortunate they removed the unscaled UV input. Like I said, it was a few versions ago, so if you've just started working with Vue, then you've probably never seen it. But it's pretty useful for things.